There's a photograph from 1945 that Joan Crawford kept on her mantle for years. She's sitting in the garden of her Brentwood house, white dress, perfect hair, and two small children arranged on either side of her like props in a magazine spread. The children are smiling, Joan is smiling. The roses behind them are in full bloom. Everything is exactly as it should be. Christina Crawford was 4 years old in that photograph. She has said in interviews, in her memoir, in testimony that has outlasted every attempt to discredit it, that the smiling stopped the moment the camera was put away. The photograph still exists. The roses are long dead. And the question that hangs over every frame of every Joan Crawford film ever made, every tearful close-up, every clenched jaw, every performance of maternal sacrifice and suffering, is the one that cannot be answered now that everyone involved is gone. How much of it was real? This is not a story about whether Joan Crawford was a monster. The people best positioned to answer that question cannot agree, and they were there. This is a story about 4 children who were adopted by one of the most powerful women in Hollywood and grew up inside a story that wasn't theirs. A story about what it cost to be raised as someone else's image. And a story about what happens when the image finally cracks. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The woman before the mother. To understand what Joan Crawford did to her children, you have to understand what the world did to Joan Crawford first. Because the woman who stood over a 4-year-old girl in the middle of the night demanding perfectly smooth bed corners was not born that way. She was built that way, piece by piece, year by year, by a Hollywood machine that taught her exactly one thing: perfection is survival, and nothing less will do. She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur in San Antonio, Texas, on March 23, 1904, or 1905, or 1906. The year changes depending on which document you're looking at, and that ambiguity is not accidental. Joan Crawford spent her entire life editing her own origin story, and she started before she was famous enough for anyone to care. Her father, Thomas LeSueur, abandoned the family before she was old enough to remember his face. Her mother, Annabelle, remarried a man named Henry Cassine who ran a vaudeville theater in Lawton, Oklahoma, and for a few years, young Lucille had something close to stability. She grew up watching performers from the wings, studying the way people transformed themselves under lights, the way applause could remake a person's face in real time. Then Cassine's business failed amid allegations of embezzlement, and the family collapsed again. They moved to Kansas City. Her mother took in laundry. Lucille was sent to Rockingham Academy as a working student, which meant she scrubbed floors and waited on tables to pay for her education. The other students made sure she knew the difference between herself and them. She learned it very well. What she learned specifically was this: there are people who are served, and people who serve, and the only way to cross from one side to the other is to become someone else entirely. She danced obsessively. She worked her way into local theater, then into traveling reviews, then into the chorus lines of Broadway, where she was just another pretty girl with good legs and an appetite for work that alarmed the other dancers. MGM talent scouts saw her in New York in 1924. They offered her a screen test. She took it with both hands and never looked back at anything she was leaving behind. The studio changed her name, Louis B. Mayer didn't think Lucille LeSueur sounded like a star, so they held a magazine contest. Readers sent in suggestions, and the winner was Joan Crawford, which Lucille hated. She said it sounded like crawfish. But she used it anyway, because the studio owned her name the way they owned her contract and her image and her carefully constructed biography. And you did not argue with MGM in 1925 if you wanted to keep eating. What followed was one of the most sustained acts of self-invention in Hollywood history. Joan Crawford, the name she'd been assigned, became Joan Crawford, the woman she decided to be. She studied the other actresses. She watched how Norma Shearer moved through a room, how Greta Garbo deflected attention by withholding herself. She took lessons, diction, dancing, deportment. She read voraciously, compensating for the formal education she'd never received. She wrote thank you notes to everyone. She remembered birthdays. She treated the crew on her films with a warmth she rarely managed to show in her private life, because she understood instinctively that popularity was a form of protection. By the late 1920s, she was one of MGM's biggest stars. Dancing daughters, our dancing daughters, these were her vehicles, flappers and working girls, women who wanted more than what they'd been given. The audiences loved her because she looked like someone who had earned it the hard way, someone who was fighting because she was. Then sound came in, and half the silent era was over, and Joan Crawford kept going. She adapted, she evolved, she made Grand Hotel with Greta Garbo in 1932 and held her own against a legend. She made The Women in 1939 and all but stole the film from under a cast of the best actresses in Hollywood. She had 4 marriages, each of which ended badly enough to become tabloid legend. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. she loved. Franchot Tone, who taught her about theater and literature and whom she drove away with her ambition. Philip Terry, who barely registered. Alfred Steele, who came much later, the Pepsi-Cola executive who gave her something like peace in her final years. But in between all of that, between the marriages and the films and the feuds and the comeback and the Oscar, she became a mother. And that is where the story gets complicated. The adoption. Joan Crawford's first husband, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., did not want children. Her second husband, Franchot Tone, wanted them desperately, and several pregnancies ended in miscarriage before the marriage ended in divorce. Joan, by the late 1930s, wanted a child badly enough that she was willing to get one without a husband. She adopted her first child in June of 1940, a baby girl she named Christina. The adoption was handled privately, quietly, through channels that the studio helped arrange, because MGM preferred things to be arranged rather than discovered. The announcement was made to the press. Joan Crawford was a devoted single mother. Joan Crawford had chosen love over her career. Joan Crawford was giving this lucky child everything a little girl could ever want. The publicity photographs were gorgeous. Joan looked like a Madonna. Christina looked like the answer to a prayer. What happened inside the house on Bristol Avenue in Brentwood, and later the house on North Roxbury Drive, is the subject of the most contested memoir in Hollywood history. But it's worth pausing here on what is not contested, even by the people who dispute the details. Joan Crawford was, by every account, a woman of extraordinary control. Her homes were immaculate. Her closets were organized with a precision that her housekeepers have described in interviews as almost liturgical. She believed absolutely in cleanliness, in order, in the correct way of doing things. The correct way was her way, and deviations from it were not tolerated easily. Whether that translates into abuse depends on who you ask. Christina Crawford was born February 22, 1939, and adopted at 6 weeks old. She was, by her own account and by the account of people who knew her as a child, a beautiful and bright little girl who grew into a headstrong young woman, and the collision between her personality and her mother's was apparently spectacular. The early years, Christina has said, were confusing precisely because there were good times. Joan could be warm, could be generous, could be the dazzling mother she presented to the world. Birthday parties were extraordinary productions. Christmas was theatrical. Joan entertained constantly, and when she entertained, her children were displayed like evidence of her generosity, well-dressed, well-behaved, proof that she was exactly the woman the public believed her to be. But the cameras always went away. And when they did, according to Christina, something else came in: the wire hangers. This is the detail that everyone knows, the image that has become so embedded in the cultural memory of Joan Crawford that it's almost impossible now to see the actress without seeing the accusation superimposed over her. No wire hangers, screams Faye Dunaway in the 1981 film adaptation of the memoir, and that line has been quoted so many times that it functions as both shorthand and parody, which is perhaps the worst possible outcome for a serious allegation. But what Christina actually described in the book was a system, not isolated incidents of anger, but a pattern: the midnight inspections of closets and drawers, the white glove tests for dust, the punishments that arrived in the middle of the night when her mother was drinking and the household was at its most vulnerable. The worst incidents, in Christina's account, involved not just beatings but a quality of deliberate psychological control. the withholding of food, the public humiliations, the sense that her mother's love was always conditional, and the conditions were always shifting. She was sent away to school, multiple schools. Each time she was expelled or left under difficult circumstances, she came back to a mother who had already moved on, who had redefined the household's reality, who seemed to experience her daughter's presence as a kind of challenge to her authority that needed to be met and overcome. Christina grew up beautiful, like her mother, dark-haired, striking. She pursued an acting career which Joan Crawford consistently undermined, replacing her daughter in a soap opera role when Christina was recovering from surgery, refusing to use her connections to advance her career while simultaneously being photographed as her loving mother. She married 3 times. She wrote her book. Mommy Dearest was published in 1978, a year after Joan Crawford's death. It sold 4 million copies. It destroyed Joan Crawford's public image in a way that no living person could have managed. It divided Crawford's world into people who believed it and people who considered it a betrayal by an ungrateful child with scores to settle. The people who disbelieved it pointed to the timing. Joan was dead and could not defend herself. They pointed to Christina's career difficulties and suggested motivation. They pointed to the twins who emphatically disagreed with Christina's characterization of their mother. The people who believed it pointed to corroboration. Christina's brother Christopher, who had his own painful memories. Former employees who confirmed certain aspects of the household's atmosphere. The structure of the abuse she described, the way it escalated when Joan was drinking, the way it tracked her career anxieties, which fit recognizable patterns. Christina has spent 45 years defending her account. She is still alive. The argument is, in a very real sense, still happening. Christopher. Joan Crawford adopted her second child, a boy she named Christopher, in 1943. He was initially named Philip Terry Jr., after her third husband, and renamed when that marriage ended. Christopher has always been the quieter presence in this story, not because his experience was less significant, but because he has told it less publicly. What Christopher has confirmed, in interviews given over the decades, is that the physical discipline was real, that the household was governed by fear as much as love, and that his experience of their mother was not the benign figure the twins have described. His relationship with Joan Crawford was particularly marked by what might be called the twinning problem. Christopher was adopted as a playmate for Christina, a companion, a second child to round out the family portrait. But he and Christina were close in age and close in their experience of the household, and Joan appears to have experienced this solidarity between them as a kind of opposition. 2 children who might compare notes, 2 children who might confirm each other's versions of events. When Christopher was older and began having difficulties of his own, trouble at school, the ordinary rebellions of adolescence amplified by a childhood that had not been ordinary, Joan's response was to send him away. Not to boarding school in the conventional sense, but to a series of institutions that functioned, in his account, more as places of punishment than education. He was sent to Chadwick School, then to a military school. The correspondence between mother and son during these years, fragments of which have surfaced in biographies, has a quality that Christina's supporters have found revealing. Joan's letters to Christopher oscillating between expressions of love and detailed recitations of his failures, as if she were building a case against him even as she professed affection. Christopher became a merchant marine. He built a life far from Hollywood and far from his mother's orbit. He gave interviews occasionally, confirmed what he could confirm, and largely declined to make his story the center of his life the way Christina did. He was excluded from Joan Crawford's will, along with Christina. The stated reason was that they knew why. He has said in so many words that he does know why. He has also said that the reason is not the one his mother wanted people to assume, not ingratitude or disloyalty, but something closer to the opposite. He and Christina had, in Joan's view, refused to maintain the story she needed them to maintain. They had declined to be evidence of her motherhood. The night she won the Oscar, March 29, 1945, the Academy Awards for Films of 1944, Joan Crawford was nominated for Best Actress for Mildred Pierce, the film that had resurrected her career after MGM dropped her, the film that proved she was not finished, not over, not the has-been the industry had quietly agreed she had become. She did not attend the ceremony. This is sometimes presented as false modesty, a theatrical move calculated to generate sympathy and attention. And there's probably something to that. Joan Crawford was not naive about optics, and she understood perfectly well that a sick actress receiving her Oscar in bed was more compelling than an actress sitting in a theater waiting. She was in bed at Brentwood with a respiratory infection when the envelope was opened and her name was read. Director Michael Curtiz came to her house with the Academy Award, and photographers documented the moment. Joan in bed, beautifully lit, the statuette in her hands, tears on her face. It was a perfect image. It was the kind of image she had been constructing her entire career. Christina Crawford was 5 years old. In the decades since, Christina has placed the events of her childhood not on a specific timeline. Memory doesn't work that way. But she has been consistent about what the atmosphere of those years felt like. And what she has described is a household in which Joan's professional anxieties translated directly into domestic intensity. When the career was difficult, when Joan felt threatened or overlooked or afraid, the children experienced the consequences. The years around Mildred Pierce were years of professional crisis for Joan Crawford. She had been fired by MGM after 18 years. She was fighting to prove she still mattered. She was drinking. She was terrified. Christina was 5. The trophy is real. The testimony is real. The distance between those two facts, between the image of the triumphant actress in bed with her Oscar and the image of what was happening in the rooms of that house, is the distance this entire story lives in. The performance of motherhood, Joan Crawford's genius, professionally, was her absolute commitment to the work. Directors who worked with her describe a woman who arrived at every set thoroughly prepared, who knew every line, who hit every mark, who understood instinctively what the camera was capturing and adjusted herself accordingly. She was not a natural the way some actors are natural. Everything she did, she had studied, practiced, and refined. But the result of all that work was performances that felt utterly real. The problem, if you believe her children, was that she couldn't turn it off. Or rather, she could turn it on and off, and the switching was the terror. The Joan Crawford who posed for photographs with her children was warm, demonstrative, visibly loving. The hugs were real hugs. The smiles were real smiles. And then the cameras went away and something else came out. Something that had perhaps been suppressed by the effort of performance and was released now that the audience was gone. Christina has described the experience of never knowing which mother was coming through the door, the public Joan or the private Joan, the loving version or the frightening one. This uncertainty, the inability to predict what the emotional climate would be, is itself a recognized feature of abusive households, independent of any specific incident. The unpredictability is the abuse. The child spends all of their energy reading the room, scanning for signals, trying to stay one step ahead of the anger. Joan's own childhood had been exactly this: a father who disappeared, a mother who was inconsistent, a series of households where the rules changed without warning, and the child had to adapt constantly to survive. What Joan learned from that childhood, what she internalized so deeply that it became her, was hypervigilance, the ability to read any room and adjust. It made her a survivor. It made her a star. And if you believe Christina, it made her a dangerous mother, because she reproduced the conditions of her own childhood without ever understanding that she was doing it. The irony is almost too painful to sit with. Joan Crawford adopted children specifically to give them the stability she had never had. She said this publicly, and she probably meant it. She had been the poor girl, the girl who scrubbed floors, the girl who was looked down on, and she was going to give her children everything: the house, the clothes, the education, the name, the life. She did give them those things. She just couldn't give them the one thing she had never had herself: safety. The twins. In July 1947, Joan Crawford adopted twin girls. She named them Kathy and Cindy. They were her third and fourth children, adopted together, a matched set, and from the very beginning their experience of their mother was different from their older siblings. Part of this is simply age. Kathy and Cindy were born 3 years after Christopher, 6 years after Christina, and by the time they arrived, Joan's career had been revived by Mildred Pierce. The worst years of professional anxiety, the years when fear seemed to drive her behavior most intensely, were, for the twins, years they were too young to witness or simply years that had already passed. Part of it is also position. Christina and Christopher occupied a specific role in Joan's household. They were the older children, the ones with personalities formed enough to have opinions, to push back, to confirm or deny. The twins arrived as babies and were, in some ways, more malleable. They became, in the household's social order, the younger siblings who were less threatening to Joan's authority precisely because they were younger. What Kathy and Cindy have said, publicly and consistently throughout their lives, is that their mother was loving and warm. That she was strict, yes, they don't deny the strictness, but that her strictness was the normal kind, the kind that children grow up and recognize as care. They remember a mother who took them to school and was interested in their school reports and attended their events and was, in the ways that mattered, present. They have said they do not recognize the woman in Mommy Dearest. They have said Christina's book was not their experience. They have said that their sister's anger, while perhaps real, is anger at something that was not what they saw. This disagreement is one of the most significant and least resolvable aspects of this entire story. Because if 4 children experience the same woman so differently, what does that tell us? Several things, possibly. Children in the same household often have radically different relationships with an abusive parent. Sometimes one child is targeted and others are spared, for reasons that can seem arbitrary and cruel. The oldest child, the one who first challenges the parent's authority, is often the one who bears the brunt of it. The youngest children, raised when the parent is older or more stable or simply tired, often have a genuinely different experience. It's also possible that Christina and Christopher's accounts are accurate, and the twins are also accurate, that they are all describing the same woman seen from different angles, different years, different emotional positions, and all of them are telling the truth as they experienced it. What's harder to explain, within a framework of straightforward denial, is the will. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The will. Joan Crawford died on May 10, 1977, of a heart attack in her New York apartment. She was in her early 70s, though as with her birth year, the exact number was disputed even by people who should have known. Her death came after years of decline. The final films had been low-budget horror pictures. Her health had been failing. She had become increasingly reclusive after the death of her 4th husband, Alfred Steele. She had converted to Christian Science in her later years, which meant refusing certain medical treatments on religious grounds, a decision that may have hastened what the official cause of death euphemistically called acute myocardial infarction. She left behind a will, and in that will she had specifically excluded 2 of her 4 children. "It is my intention," the will read, "to make no provision herein for my son Christopher or my daughter Christina, for reasons which are well known to them." The reasons which are well known to them. Not explained, not elaborated, simply stated as a fact and left for everyone else to interpret. The twins received modest bequests. The bulk of the estate went to charitable organizations and institutions Joan had supported throughout her life. Christina, who had just lost her mother, and whatever complicated hope might still have existed for reconciliation, received nothing. Christopher, same. The official message was, "You know what you did." What had they done? This is where it gets interesting, because Joan Crawford did not leave behind an explanation, and the explanations offered since her death have been multiple and contradictory. Joan's defenders have suggested that she cut them out because they were ungrateful, because they had been difficult children and difficult adults, because they had embarrassed her or failed to live up to the family image she worked so hard to maintain. In this reading, the disinheritance is the action of a mother who had given everything and received nothing in return. Christina has suggested in various interviews that the real reason was that Joan knew what was coming, that she was aware of Christina's plans to write about her childhood, or at least aware that her daughter's view of their relationship was not the one Joan wanted on record. In this reading, the disinheritance was preemptive. a way of discrediting Christina before she could speak, of establishing a legal record of maternal rejection that would make any future testimony easier to dismiss. Christopher has been characteristically more restrained, but has suggested that the disinheritance was consistent with how Joan treated anyone who refused to maintain her chosen narrative. She required loyalty, and the form loyalty took in her household was agreement. Silence was loyalty. Confirmation was loyalty. The refusal to confirm was betrayal. What is certain is that the will created a wound that has never healed. 4 siblings who might have grieved together, who might have found in each other some shared language for the strange and difficult experience of being Joan Crawford's children, were instead split by it. The twins who received something, the older siblings who received a message. What biographers found. In the decades since Mommy Dearest was published, a small industry of Joan Crawford biography has developed, and what those biographers have found has complicated the picture in both directions. On the one hand, former employees have corroborated aspects of Christina's account. Housekeepers have described the midnight inspections, the obsessive cleanliness, the atmosphere of tension that pervaded the household. Joan's secretary for many years described a woman who was warm and generous to almost everyone except her oldest daughter, toward whom she seemed to harbor an active antagonism that intensified as Christina grew into a woman who resembled her too closely. The resemblance issue is one that multiple biographers have raised. Christina was beautiful in the same way Joan was beautiful. As she grew up, the daughter began to eclipse the mother in the way that daughters sometimes do. And Joan Crawford, a woman who had built her entire identity on being the most striking person in any room, appears not to have handled that gracefully. There are accounts of Joan undermining Christina's appearance and confidence, of comparing them unfavorably and publicly, of the particular cruelty that a woman who has suffered for her beauty can inflict on another woman who has it too easily. On the other hand, other accounts have complicated Christina's narrative. There are people who knew the family who say that Christina was a difficult child, willful, defiant, prone to exactly the kind of confrontation that would provoke a woman like Joan Crawford. This is sometimes offered as exculpatory, and it isn't. Difficult children are not responsible for abuse, and willfulness is a normal feature of childhood rather than a provocation. But it does suggest that the relationship was more complicated than a simple story of innocent victim and monstrous perpetrator. What the biographers tend to agree on is this: Joan Crawford had a drinking problem that got worse as her career anxiety intensified. She had experienced severe trauma in her own childhood and received no help for it. She had built an identity predicated on control, and when control was threatened, by career difficulties, by marital failures, by a daughter who refused to behave correctly, she responded in ways that a controlled, sober, emotionally healthy person would not have. None of that is exculpation. It's an explanation, and explanations are sometimes the most disturbing thing of all, because they remind us that the monsters in these stories are also people, damaged, frightened, alone in the ways that matter most, and that the damage they inflict comes from the damage they carry, passed forward through generations until someone finally decides to stop. The comeback in the second act. Here is something that often gets lost in the Mommy Dearest narrative. Joan Crawford's professional story is genuinely extraordinary, and understanding it matters for understanding everything else. She was dropped by MGM in 1943 after 18 years. The studio that had made her had decided she was finished, and in Hollywood, when the studio decides you're finished, you usually are. She was 40 years old. She had no studio contract, no safety net, and an industry that was very good at forgetting people the moment they stopped being useful. What she did next was remarkable. She negotiated a contract with Warner Brothers. She chose Mildred Pierce, a property nobody else wanted, a melodrama about a self-made woman who sacrifices everything for an ungrateful daughter, and she fought for it. She lobbied the director. She convinced them to cast her against type. She showed up every day and she worked. The film was a hit. The Oscar was real. The comeback was complete. But think about what Mildred Pierce actually is. A story about a woman who builds herself from nothing, who sacrifices her own happiness for her children, who is ultimately betrayed by the daughter she loved most. Joan Crawford didn't just choose this film. She identified with it so completely that she seemed to absorb it into her own self-image. She was Mildred Pierce, the devoted, suffering, ultimately wronged mother. She played variations on this theme for the rest of her career. Women who had suffered and endured and been wronged. Women whose sacrifices were not appreciated. Women who had given everything and received betrayal. You could read this as a coincidence of the roles available to women of a certain age in Hollywood. You could also read it as Joan Crawford building, film by film, a public record of her own mythology. A sustained argument, made in the language of cinema, that she was the mother who had given everything and was owed gratitude she never received. Christina's memoir, in this light, reads like the rebuttal to a case Joan had been making her entire career. The book, Mommy Dearest, was published on September 22, 1978. Joan Crawford had been dead for 16 months. Christina later said she had been working on the book for years, that she had started writing it not as an act of revenge but as an act of survival, a way of making sense of a childhood that had left her with damage she was still discovering. She published it, she said, because the mythologizing had already begun. The fan tributes, the hagiographies, the loving retrospectives of a Hollywood legend, they had started immediately after Joan's death, and none of them bore any resemblance to the woman Christina had known. The book is not a perfect document. Christina was, by her own admission, working from memory, and memory is imperfect. The narrative has a quality of theatrical intensity that reflects both the reality she describes and, possibly, the inheritance of growing up in a household where everything was performance. Some specific details have been questioned. The broad patterns have been confirmed by enough independent sources that dismissing it entirely requires motivated reasoning. What it did, culturally, was seismic. It single-handedly created the template for the celebrity memoir of abuse, the insider account, the behind-the-curtain revelation, the revelation that the beloved public figure was a private monster. Books like this are common now. In 1978, there was nothing like it. Joan Crawford's defenders came out immediately and forcefully. Stars who had worked with her, friends who had loved her, fans who had built their emotional lives around her image. Mervyn LeRoy said the book was a complete fabrication. Joseph Mankiewicz, who had directed her, couldn't believe it. The columnist Liz Smith wrote that she hoped it wasn't true. The fans were vicious to Christina in a way that has arguably never stopped. To this day, there are people who consider her the villain of this story, an ungrateful daughter who attacked a dead woman for profit. The misogyny built into this reading is considerable. Christina is the difficult woman, the betrayer, the one whose anger makes her untrustworthy. Joan is the star, the legend, the artist. That the person claiming victimhood is dismissed and the person being accused is defended. That pattern has a long history in the stories we tell about powerful people. The film, the 1981 film adaptation of Mommy Dearest, directed by Frank Perry and starring Faye Dunaway, is one of the strangest artifacts in Hollywood history. Dunaway's performance was intended to be serious. It became camp. The wire hanger scene, the axing of the rose garden, the extraordinary physicality of Dunaway's Joan Crawford, it played as high melodrama in a way that the film hadn't quite intended, and audiences began responding to it as dark comedy. The film became a midnight movie staple. People threw wire hangers at the screen. They quoted lines back in unison. They dressed as Joan Crawford and went to screenings in character. What this did to Christina's account was complicated. On one hand, the film brought the story to an audience of millions who might never have read the book. On the other hand, it made the story safe in a way that true horror shouldn't be safe. When no wire hangers becomes a punchline, it's harder to remember that what it refers to is a child being beaten in the middle of the night. Christina has said that she found the film's campification deeply painful, that the story she had told in the most painful honesty she possessed had been turned into entertainment in the most literal possible sense, that the horror of her childhood had been made funny, which is perhaps the cruelest thing that could have happened to it. The irony is almost too much. Joan Crawford's whole career was built on the transformation of pain into entertainment. Her films gave audiences the pleasure of watching a woman suffer beautifully. And then the story of what happened behind the camera was also transformed into entertainment, just entertainment of a different kind. The twins' defense. Kathy and Cindy Crawford, now Kathy Lalonde and Cindy Jordan, have maintained their defense of their mother consistently and, it seems, genuinely. They were not simply performing loyalty, they were articulating an experience that was real to them. They have said that Joan was strict but fair, that the house had rules, as all houses have rules, that their mother attended their school events and took an interest in their lives and was, in the ways a mother is supposed to be there. They have said that Christina's version of events bears no resemblance to their experience. What they have not been able to fully explain, and this is not a condemnation because there may not be an explanation, is the will. If Joan Crawford cut out Christina and Christopher simply because they were ungrateful or difficult, why did she not explain this more clearly? Why the cryptic reasons which are well known to them? Why the preemptive disinheritance of children who were, as far as anyone can tell from the outside, living ordinary and unremarkable lives? The twins have suggested that Joan knew about Christina's book or suspected it was coming, that the disinheritance was a response to betrayal. But Christina had not yet published anything when Joan died. The book was still years away. What this leaves is a gap, a space between the twins' loving experience and the older siblings' painful one, a space that nothing can fully bridge now. The woman who might have explained it is dead. The explanations she left behind are insufficient. 4 children, 1 woman, 4 different experiences of the same life. The closer you look, the harder it gets to hold a single version of the story. The question of love. Here is something that the most careful accounts of Joan Crawford's motherhood tend to acknowledge, and that the simpler accounts tend to skip. She may have loved her children and harmed them simultaneously. These are not mutually exclusive. A person can love fiercely and still damage what they love. A person can desperately want to be a good parent and reproduce the conditions of their own terrible childhood. Love as a feeling is not the same as love as a practice, and people who experience childhood trauma often find that the gap between the two, between the love they feel and the love they are capable of expressing safely, is the precise size of the wound they're carrying. Joan Crawford wanted to be a mother. This seems genuinely true. The lengths she went to in order to adopt children, the public devotion she maintained, the fact that she chose to keep going after the difficulties with Christina and Christopher, adopting the twins several years later. This doesn't read like pure performance. Pure performance would have been one child, photographed beautifully, displayed at the right events. She kept going. She wanted this. What she couldn't give, apparently, was predictability, safety, the knowledge that love would not be withdrawn. These are the things a traumatized person struggles most to provide, because they never received them. And you can't give what you don't have. Not without help, not without work, not without the kind of honest reckoning with your own history that Hollywood in the 1940s and 1950s was spectacularly ill-equipped to facilitate. Joan Crawford never went to therapy in any meaningful sense. The culture around her did not encourage it. She was a star, a legend, a self-made woman who had survived everything thrown at her. You didn't seek help, you endured, you controlled, you performed. And when the performance was the problem, there was nowhere to go. The legacy of the children. Christina Crawford is in her mid-80s. She has spent her entire adult life defined, to some extent, by her book, by the decision she made at 39 to put her childhood into print and let the world judge it. She has had, by her own account, a difficult life. The health struggles, the marriages, the sense of having been marked by her origin in a way she could not escape. She has also built something from it, a career as a speaker, an advocate, a person who has used her story to speak about child abuse in a way that has reached people who needed to hear it. Christopher Crawford has lived more quietly, merchant marine, private life, occasional interviews. He is the secondary figure in a story that centers, for most purposes, on his sister. The twins have aged into relatively private women who give occasional interviews when Joan Crawford's legacy is being discussed, and who consistently, graciously hold their own version of their mother. None of the 4 children ever had a public reconciliation. None of the 4 children ever arrived at a shared story. The splits in the family, older siblings against twins, the will against the children it excluded, never healed. Joan Crawford's death did not resolve anything. It simply made resolution impossible. This is perhaps the most telling thing about her motherhood. It did not create a family. It created 4 individuals with 4 separate, incompatible stories about where they came from, bound together by a name they were given rather than a bond they grew. What she left behind. Joan Crawford left behind a filmography of extraordinary range: Grand Hotel, The Women, Mildred Pierce, Sudden Fear, which she made herself on a shoestring after the studios wrote her off again, and which is one of the finest suspense films of the 1950s. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane with Bette Davis, which she maneuvered herself into in 1962 in the cleverest piece of career management of an already brilliantly managed career. The story of that production, the feud, the competition, the 2 aging stars going at each other, is its own legend. She left behind a perfume endorsement empire built around her name and her image in retirement. She left behind the Pepsi-Cola board of directors, where she served after her husband's death, where she reportedly conducted herself with the same ferocious professionalism she had brought to every studio lot. She left behind the mythology, the most glamorous star of her era, the survivor, the woman who remade herself from nothing, and nothing could stop her. And she left behind 4 children who have spent their lives navigating the distance between that mythology and the house on Bristol Avenue in Brentwood, where a little girl grew up trying to understand why love felt like this. So bright, so warm, so real when it was on, and so completely, terrifyingly gone when it wasn't. The question that stays, the question that every person who loves Joan Crawford eventually has to sit with, is not whether she was a monster. The evidence is too mixed for that verdict to satisfy. The question is what we do with the fact that we don't know. We watch her films with this uncertainty built in now. When she plays Mildred Pierce crying over an ungrateful daughter, we cannot unknow what we know. When she plays a mother in any context, we bring the weight of Christina's testimony into the theater with us. When she turns those extraordinary eyes on the camera, that face that was simultaneously the most controlled and the most raw face in Hollywood, we wonder what was happening behind it. Some people find this intolerable. They want to keep the films clean, separate from the life, experience the art without the context. There is a reasonable argument for this. Art is art, and biography is biography, and the woman on the screen is a character, not a person. But there's also something honest about the discomfort. The discomfort is the truth. We made Joan Crawford. The industry made her. Audiences made her. The entire machinery of Hollywood celebrity made her. And what we made was someone who learned so thoroughly to perform that the performance became the person, and the children inside the performance never had a chance to find out who their mother was when no one was watching. She won an Oscar the night her daughter says she was being abused. The trophy is still on display. Her daughter's testimony is still in print. Between those 2 facts, something irreducible lives, not a verdict, not a resolution, but a question. How much of it was acting? All of it? None of it? Both? Neither? The answer changes depending on which child you ask, and that in the end is the most Joan Crawford answer possible. The truth depends entirely on where you were standing when the camera came on. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.